Let's talk about the phasing Canoptek horrors that are perhaps one of the biggest datasheet winners in the new Codex Necrons. It seems the Wraiths may be looking rather great going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd do a quick datasheet review on the Necron Wraiths, seemingly one of the single biggest winners out of the Necron Codex update, both looking a lot stronger on their raw datasheets and having some great supporting rules, far better than they were before. Really quite nice to see them return as a more credible option. They have previously been a bit of a tough Necron melee powerhouse in the past. In the video we'll talk briefly about their model, go through their datasheet bit by bit, talk about their new leader option in the Technomancer, and the very powerful things that they can get from the detachments, particularly the Canoptek Court and the Awakened Dynasty. In the lore, the Wraiths are Canoptek constructs of the Necrons. They had a bit of a lore change when they redid Codex Necrons last time round, changing from being Necrons themselves to Necron construct machines. These ones apparently patrolling the sleeping tomb world for interlopers as they inspect and maintain Necron machinery, guarding against stasis field failures, or any of the other things that might beset their technology on their millennia-long slumber. The Wraiths incorporate phase shifters into their design, allowing them to glitch in and out of reality between different dimensions, allowing them to pass through walls and reach internal parts of machinery if needed to in their maintenance duties. This will also be bad news for any interlopers they manage to catch on their rounds. It won't be the nicest for them if they have a Wraith's blade materialise in the middle of them, completely bypassing their armour. The plastic kit from Games Workshop is this one, £37.50, €50 or $60, and that gets you 3 of these Wraiths miniatures, a little bit bigger than your standard infantry type offering these. I feel like they're maybe not the worst kit for the points compared with certain smaller kits that you often get the similar amount of models for this kind of price. And they do have a few options that you can build with them, either the claws or the whip coils, and 2 different types of ranged weapons, the particle casters or the transdimensional beamers. They are kind of fragile models though, particularly the ones with the whip coils have some very flimsy parts on them, and even the standard ones are sort of slender on their coiled bodies. Certainly quite fun minis though, some sort of unholy fusion between metallic snake and spider or scarab, not the sort of thing that your warriors are probably going to want to have jump out at them. As always, if you were looking to pick up these miniatures at a bit of a discount, there are some discount 40k sellers linked in the video description below. Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, or Fenris Workshop in Canada. They've got various discounts around the world, and they're all linked down in the video description. Any purchases help support the channel, as well as save you a bit of money. As mentioned though, in the new Necrons Codex, Canoptek Wraiths have had a bit of an overhaul. At time of recording, we're still waiting for an updated points cost for them, though previously they were 110 points or 220 points as per Games Workshop's last version of the Minotaur and Field Manual. I don't suspect that they'd change too much from that, but even if they went up a tiny bit, I don't think it would be a big problem given their much better abilities. In the units you get 3 to 6 models with this profile. They're pretty fast on the movement, getting a boosted move from 9 inches up to 10 inches, and they have the beast and fly keyword, so they work pretty well with moving through enemy models and terrain. I guess that basically represents them phasing in and out of reality. As well as being fast, they really are quite durable. Toughness 6 with a big 4 wounds now when previously there were 3, a 3+ armor save, and perhaps more importantly a 4+ invulnerable save, making them a lot more resilient against high AP things like anti-tank fire. It's really quite a well-rounded defensive profile that. Both small arms and heavy guns are going to struggle. I guess the best thing to take them down would be things like autocannon firepower. Anything mid-strength and mid-damage should do kind of well. As I mentioned, they can get considerably tougher with the addition of a Technomancer, and they do have the standard reanimation protocols as well. I feel like they're one of the units that if you take them in numbers, they're quite likely to get damaged but not destroyed, and hopefully pile on a few of these tough wounds back onto the board again. Otherwise, their objective control 2, which is better than some units in their sort of weight class, means that a big unit of 6 has a big 12 OC, which is going to be hard to overcome unless the opponent puts some fairly serious weight on an objective. Though they are only leadership 8, they can't really be relied on to hold points if they're down to either 1 model or 2 models, depending on how big their start is. If they've got a Cryptek in the unit though, that does improve their leadership a bit. Then the Wraiths both get some ranged weapons and melee weapons. For the ranged weapons, they get the option between a particle caster and a transdimensional beamer, and where previously they cost points, now they're completely free, so you may as well take one. The particle beamers got nerfed slightly, they no longer hit on a 2+, just hitting on a 4 with strength 5, AP 0, and 3 shots to 12 inches, but they do get devastating wounds and pistol as well. In theory, the transdimensional beamers are supposed to be a bit more of an anti-elite infantry option, just a single shot per wraith hitting on a 4+ at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 3. Unfortunately though, the theory doesn't really play out for Games Workshop, as these are just kind of badly balanced. It is kind of surprising that even with the reduced ballistic skill for the particle caster, it still is basically ahead on just about every target due to that rate of fire and devastating wounds, and unless you're shooting some really specific things, then the beamer doesn't really get a look in. Against hordes, unsurprisingly the particle casters are better, but it still holds out against standard Space Marine intercessors or the standard terminators. There's less of a gap there, but you still may as well fish for the devastating wounds, and they're even better against vehicles due to dev wounds on 6s. Given that the particle caster also has the pistol keyword as well, they're just the best all round really. Games Workshop would have needed to give the beamer a bit more AP or a bit more strength if they wanted it to actually compete against some targets. Either way though, without buffs the damage output at range isn't exactly standout. Even with the particle beamers it's only something like 1 or 2 wounds to standard Space Marine intercessors, which isn't loads. Their main event is definitely the melee though even then they're a kind of low damage output unit just in general. In combat they get the choice between Vicious Claws and Whip Coils. The Vicious Claws get you 4 attacks hitting on a 4+, at strength 6, AP -1, damage 2, and they have to compete against the Whip Coils with anti-horde mode. They get you 8 attacks at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Hitting on 4+ is a little bit unfortunate for them. It does mean that they're kind of vulnerable to modifiers, but it does improve a bit in the detachments where they're best in. For the melee damage output, again is a pretty clear winner in my opinion. Out of those previous targets, the Whip Coils only do better against termagants, and even then it's not exactly excessive really. Wounding on 3s, not 2s, and not having any AP does mean that they're not really all that far ahead. Otherwise the Vicious Claws are pretty solidly better against intercessors. A unit should kill around about 1 or 2 without any buffs, and get around about triple the damage against heavier things like Terminators or Rhinos. It's still not enormous though, they're only averaging 1 failed save against those. It does kind of make them into a unit that's definitely more durable than it is dangerous, though you certainly can make them a lot more killy if they're in the right detachment. Finally they do have a third phase worth of damage dealing, and that's their Wraith form. This one's basically a mortal wound sweep attack, some damage when you move past an enemy unit, though you can only use it when you're doing a normal move, so you can't use it when you're falling back or advancing, which is kind of a shame. Again, it's not exactly huge, but will chip off a bit if you can trigger it, which you might not always be in the position to be. You roll 1 dice per each Wraith in the unit, and then on a 4+ they deal a mortal wound each, so that's an average of 3 mortal wounds for a big unit of 6, and the Technomancer would get to roll as well if he's leading the unit. In reality, it just might not often be convenient to do that compared with just moving them in a sensible way anyway, but if they can ever trigger it, it genuinely does help out their damage output a bit, and most against the things that they're going to struggle against with high saves and high toughness. Overall, putting that together, I'd say that the unit's role in 10th edition is generally going to be how they actually have been in the past, but actually a lot more effective now. For their strengths, they really are quite fast and they interact well with terrain. They're fairly tough both against small arms fire and big high strength, high AP things due to the invulnerable saves, and they're perhaps one of the better units with reanimation protocols, as you might not be able to wipe a unit of 6 of them as easily as some other Necron targets perhaps. As well as that, their objective control isn't awful, and they do have a strong leader choice with the Technomancer and some good support with the detachments as we'll mention. As for weaknesses, their damage output per model just isn't really so great, so they're not going to be just sweeping out entire massive squads of tooled up enemy elites with big damage benefits. Their leadership is low if they're depleted, and they natively hit on a 4+, so are quite vulnerable to modifiers, though that can be mitigated a bit by the detachments. Overall though, provided they don't absolutely ruin the points cost, looks like they could return as quite a nice aggressive bully unit, something that can move up the board, afford to tank a bit of firepower more than some of the rest of the army, and still absolutely happily tear apart any lighter enemy units, and then annoyingly lock up other ones. Perhaps onto the most exciting buffs for the Codex though, and along with the extra wounds, the ability to have a Technomancer in the unit is rather big. He's the Cryptek with the Canoptek Cloak that also gets to move 10 inches as well. He also has the fly keyword, and as well as providing a little bit of threat with the Staff of Light, which could help their shooting a tiny bit I guess, his main benefits are a 5+ feel no pain type save, and healing one model by D3 wounds once per turn. Both when paired together I think really isn't too bad at all for the 60 points that they were, again presuming he doesn't go up massively. On top of that, I feel like getting access to a character is big for other reasons as well. In Awakened Dynasty it allows you command protocols, which again is another massive boost. +1 to hit is excellent for the Wraiths. And perhaps just as importantly, he allows the units to get enhancements, which again are a really big thing for creating one stacked units that's really quite strong on lots of levels. The 5+ Feel No Pain is really good though. Usually that equates to effectively an extra 50% durability boost. In some cases for the Wraiths it might actually be more, given that if you were being hit by say damage 2 weapons that will quite neatly kill individual Wraiths, you might have the chance to make them threaten some overkill. The same goes for damage 4 weapons, though they're a bit rarer. The healing thing is pretty powerful as well. It means that in combination with reanimation protocols you might get theoretically up to 6 wounds returned, though in reality you might often not get the full potential of the Technomancer's healing, as you might not necessarily even have a model that's injured, it might just be either dead or alive. Overall, if you're running a 6 model unit though, this guy seems to be pretty much auto-include. The extra durability that he brings is rather massive, never mind the extra bonuses. Besides the Technomancer, I feel like the other datasheets maybe aren't the biggest helps. There's definitely lots of things in the Codex that can potentially help other Necron units in one way or another, but perhaps not that much they'd realistically really want to use on the Wraiths specifically as they make their way towards the front line. The Silent King could give rerolls and things, or potentially +1 strength in melee. They could get redeployed by the Katana Shard of the Deceiver for some better positioning. And there's a few ways that they can get some other Feel No Pains, say the Convergence of Dominion or the Gloom Prisms on a nearby spider or something, though both of those are entirely dependent on not having a Technomancer in the unit. The Reanimator could be interesting enough, I suppose, with its 3-inch range. You certainly wouldn't buy one in to specifically help out the race, but if you happen to have one on the board, then putting the unit nearby one of these could allow you some boosted first turn reanimation, particularly if the race are on the front line and are one of the only things exposed to enemy fire. In general, I just treat these as kind of nice to have if they're around, but probably not bought in for the unit specifically. Perhaps one of the biggest and most exciting things for the Wraiths is access to the Canoptek Court detachment though, this one giving you 4 rerolls to hit if you're within your power matrix, which the Wraiths could actually be a big part in pushing out to the middle of the board, zooming up and being very tanky and fighting over midfield objectives. After movement it shouldn't be too hard to have 2 mid-board objectives under Necron control. And whenever that's active, you're basically getting 4 rerolls to hit, so a 50% damage output boost. That's just extra nice for Wraiths hitting on a 4+, and I think it tips their damage output for being something kind of incidental to genuinely a big threat to most units in the game. If you had a unit of 6 of them with the particle beamers and then fighting with their claws in melee, one after the other, then these are the rough sort of numbers that you'd expect out of them. For a full turn worth of shooting and fighting, you'd average around about 20 slain enemy termagants, 7 dead intercessors, 3 dead terminators, or 9 wounds to a toughness 10 vehicle with a 3+ save. I'd argue that's pretty strong and really quite general purpose. It heavily depends on the target, but that looks like it's around about 120 points worth of models killed very roughly. And I think that's not too bad on a unit that's both really quite fast and is primarily tough rather than dangerous. Then given that it helps out the Canoptek unit so much, there's lots of really good enhancements and stratagems for them. Maybe a few of the highlights being infiltrating Wraiths, so you could put the unit with the Technomancer in the mid-board, potentially threatening some very early game charges, or locking up units in the enemy deployment zone turn 1, though it might mean venturing out of your power matrix, I guess. There's a reroll once to wound 1 while you're in your power matrix. Again, that's going to be a nice enough increase to the numbers mentioned above. And otherwise there are some pretty good stratagems. 2 CP for devastating wounds in melee, very helpful for those claws to penetrate some 2+ enemy saves potentially. A 1 command point reactive move of 6 inches when the enemy moves within 9 inches, that could be very disruptive and maybe keep them safe. And a very spooky 1 command point can't be shot greater than 12 inches away rule. That one could be utterly horrible if your opponents just lined up their shooting units to try and deal with a problematic unit of Wraiths maybe on one flank. If they haven't moved up their units to put them right next to the Wraiths, then you could maybe have the enemy shooting far less guns at them than they might otherwise have thought they could. Pretty brutal, and seems like a unit that you could definitely have multiple units buffed by Technomancers in this formation. The other big detachment for the Wraiths will be the Awakened Dynasty. This one certainly got a lot more interesting now the Wraiths can be led by a character, a +1 to hit for having the Cryptek in the squad. The +1 to hit isn't quite as good as fully rerolling hit rolls, but it's not far off, generally a 33% damage increase rather than 50, but you'll still be getting numbers that aren't too far away with the ones on the previous slide. And it's not dependent on the power matrix being established on the board. Otherwise, for supporting rules, there's the new versions of the Awakened Dynasty stratagems, the stealth enhancement for an extra -1 to hit at range, a 1 command point for a reactive reanimation of D3+1. Hungry Void seems quite threatening for 1 command point for +1 strength and +1 attack. 5 attacks at strength 7 hitting on a 3+ does seem pretty terrifying for these guys. And also a couple of more situational options for supporting their shooting, advancing and shooting, and potentially re-rolling hits if needed. I feel like you'd certainly want the units to be led by Technomancer in this one, so I guess that's further advantage to going big on them. Otherwise, for the detachments, they're more just going to be surviving on the strength of their datasheet alone, maybe with a Technomancer that could be tempting, though it's not going to be anywhere near as strong in terms of damage as the other two. The Hypercrypt Legion is maybe the other most interesting one, being able to warp Wraiths on and off the board. I feel like they're one of the units that benefits least from that. They're able to move quite quickly and work well with terrain, and they tend to be better with melee damage than range damage as well, which means that if they're warping back onto the board, they're still going to need to do a 9-inch charge, which isn't very reliable. I guess they could have interesting enough options with getting themselves native Deep Strike to be a weird rapid ingress threat, perhaps. Or they could use a stratagem to drop just greater than 3 inches away from the enemy and then see how they deal with that. Perhaps they could still genuinely be interesting just as a unit that doesn't really use the main rules of the detachment though. I feel like you're going to be wanting to warp a lot of your army on and off the board each turn, but you can't really afford to do that with everything. You still want some tough threats to be holding objectives and forcing the opponents to try and deal with them, and perhaps Wraiths are quite good to fit that bill, I suppose. Otherwise, there's not really a lot for the Obeisance Phalanx or the Annihilation Legion. The Annihilation Legion does have an enhancement that could allow the unit to try and use a 4+2 fight in death when they're slain in melee. Feels like there's probably better targets for that though. Overall though, I'd say it's certainly looking great for the Wraiths at the moment. They appear to have gone from a very underwhelming squad to genuinely quite good in the Awakened Dynasty and the Canoptek Court. Obviously other rules pending. They've just picked up loads of wins from the Codex, +1 to their moves, +1 to wound. They're now the best unit for the Technomancer to lead, given that the Lich Guard can't take one anymore, and they've got good support in the Canoptek Court and the Awakened Dynasty, which do initially seem like some of these stronger detachment options. I think I would just be tempted to use them in a unit of 6 with a Technomancer in, take the claws and the particle casters and push up towards the midboard, ideally using terrain to keep them safe from firepower if you can go, and then depending on what they're presented with, ideally try and just delete big squads of enemy objective holders, things like standard issue Space Marines or Horde type units. Replace that unit that was on the objective with a whole bunch of Wraiths for the opponent to deal with, and then when they get the inevitable big counter attack, at least they're a big tough unit that's going to take a lot of work for the enemy to put down, and they might be able to survive to reanimate. While they're a fairly intact squad as well, they do seem like a good choice for targeting with stratagems, quite a big chunky unit that is big enough to warrant the CP expenditure. Overall, looking pretty good for them. It'll be interesting to see how they stack up against the other options in the Codex when we get the full points and everything. It seems very likely that they're going to be good though. Let me know your thoughts on the Wraiths down in the comments below. Do you have some that are looking forward to returning to the table? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.